Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. As promised, the final test, final show of hands. Who has made all 15 demos? Yeah, no, I thought the conversation was flowing too freely outside, and the cake was particularly good, so it was never going to happen, but they were great. Final stretch. Some might say they've left the best till last, but it wouldn't be me. But I'm sure that Werner is going to prove me wrong, although he seems to have lost his presentation. Are you ready to go, Werner?
Yeah, okay, da unten, okay.
He's lost the mouse pointer, that's the problem.
Yep. Rechter Mausklick oder was?
Jetzt auf die Maus benutzen können.
Ja, das ist mir vielleicht lieber, genau.
Okay, so welcome from me. I'm working at Bayerischer Rundfunk, and I was sort of, part of the creative team of the ORPHEUS project, trying to build some of the demos that you hopefully have experienced this morning and this afternoon here. So we did quite a few things in productions, and to make all these features, try to think what of these kind of things would work in the actual broadcast world, because many of the demos that you've seen from Bayerischer Rundfunk are really part of that sort of ongoing broadcasting genres and formats that we already have. It was less experimental than, for example, The Mermaid's Tears from the BBC, which was a completely new approach, but we tried to sort of, get along with the practical thing in broadcasting as we do it now, and try to find out how can we enhance existing formats from content with new object-based features. And the only thing I will try to explain you here is something about variable length. So variable length is really some of those most demanded features that everybody talks about, make program adaptive and make it accessible and make it, that you don't have to do it, in the full length. And why do we do that? It's just because of that machine. And if we haven't got this machine, which was invented some 80 years ago or on the market, radio would have been completely different. So this is, for me, still the picture of being in a linear world is like a tape that you wind and move up and down, and this is the linear world. And everything that we do on the web today is more or less even still that picture. So we put in the programs mostly as they were broadcast and make them into podcasts and make them into formats that are already there. So it's nothing that is really thrilling when you think about all the other possibilities of interactivity that the web offers. All my colleagues here have already talked about in detail about the possibilities of being interactive and making stories in different levels and these kind of things. But one of the features, as I just said, is to make it adaptive in length. So this is one of those key things that my colleague Chris showed in the very first meeting in Erlangen. And he said it has to do with sausage. So everything in broadcasting has to do with sausage. And the thing is, the big one is too much to swallow at a time, and what we do is to slice it up. So what are the possibilities to slice a program and make it, into segments that hopefully are also in a value on its own, but you can reshuffle them, you bring them in different orders, or find new contexts that you can make out of it. So a very early experience I also made with the colleagues here at the IRT was already 10 years ago. It was a nice little thing that was called mailbox radio. And you can guess from the hand that, this wasn't a very, small thing. It was still the era where the smartphones had just begun, and we were lucky, to do something with a then still, new in favor application, which was called iTunes. A little bit of story about that is what we actually did was to use a DAB program, which was on air, and we were already segmenting the DAB program. So when the program was on air, you saw really, all the items popping in and being accessible again. So just jump back. So from a live program out, we were able to control from the faders that were made in the radio studio actually to slice a program and make it accessible. So in a way, you could say you could have already made the program in a variable length, just selecting one or two things just from that playlist. So it was the mirror from the playout system that we use, you know, being on an end-user device. So that was the mailbox radio 10 years ago. Another approach, which is very inspiring, was some 4 years ago. I think it was at the IBC where I first saw it, where the BBC R&D showed a really responsive radio thing that was a documentary which was in total 30 minutes of time, and you were able to adjust the length of the program with that slider you see in the middle. So you say, okay, I just want to have it in 15 minutes, or I want to have it in 30 minutes. So, and you could sort of, you know, move in between. Really astonishing. And when you have a look at that and how complicated it was, the colleagues who actually did the analysis for that, I think when I talked to them, they really stated they were having a hard time, quite a hard time, just to do it once for that documentary, which was very, very complex. So you see on the left-hand side, the colleague from R&D, Matthew Brooks, you know, who's sort of taken the manuscript of that piece apart, you know, trying to find out what are the different narrative levels or segments which belong together, and eventually turn that's just a screenshot from an Excel sheet into different segments that are, you know, what belongs to what and what can be done when it's done. When you have listened to this one, you may listen to that one, or if you haven't heard that one, though it makes no use to listen to this one, and these kind of things, semantic analysis within the piece to get a structure, and then sort of recombine the audio which was already there along with that thing. So there's a very interesting approach indeed, but I think still something very difficult to achieve, you know, unless there is material that you already have sort of conceived to be in that matter. So if you do some, I would say, re-engineering of an existing piece, you know, to take it again apart, you know, in different segments, and then combine it back again, it's very hard stuff. Everybody who is doing some re-engineering from in technology knows what I'm talking about. That's exactly the same. So actually that is a graph that comes out of it, and then you were able, you know, to pass through this whole thing, you know, just selecting, and it was so intelligent that we really can sort of move the slider, and then it combined these certain things and made it really in length adaptive. Very complex thing, but well, running. But Matthew Brooks once told me that eventually from that thing, another thing turned out to I think it's operated, Simon, as far as I know, or it's used. They call it the Squeezebox for TV. So what was that Squeezebox thing? It was simpler in a way because it wasn't audio. Interesting enough, the one thing that, you know, television seems to be simpler than audio. It was like an editor chooses, for example, different clips for today's news and selects a certain region and highlights certain points in that visual clip to say this is important. And what they wanted to have is something like a back timer on television to see that every hour they have 1 minute or 1 minute 10 or 1 minute 15 or 30, and to show the clips of the day of today's news. That was the practical thing. And they do it as an editor. They select the clips, they select the segments, and then they sort of, you know, and the machine then calculates it what is optimum for that sort of back timer that you really have. So what they did is they prioritized things, they selected range, and there were also some hotspot markings. And these things, you know, actually helped to develop another thing, or well, helped me to think about one aspect that I know from my own time as a news journalist is, you know, let's try to keep it practical and try to reconsider what we've already done for many, many years in broadcasting, and something that as a journalist you're trained into is the structuring of information. So this is a fairly theoretical thing that you learn when you are as a news broadcaster. You say, well, how would you structure news, or how do you structure news? And there's something called the inverted pyramid of journalism, which means if you're writing a typical news story, you should start with a lead. So the lead gives the main information: who, what, where, when, why, and how. So, you know, any accident is as if you would phone on an accident, you know, if you call the emergency, who, what, where, when, and how. These basic questions you have to put first, which is very important. Then you would put into the body some more information. It could be arguments, it could be controversy, it could be a storytelling behind that, or some issues. And then into the tail, you put all the rest which is related, but, you know, just in case you need it. So I remember from my time as a news journalist, still in analog time, when the news from our correspondents came in via telephone cables, and we had some 5 tape machines running at the time, as you've seen in the beginning. We were sort of 5 were simultaneously there. And then it was, you know, the correspondent had only a 5-minute slot on the cable. And after that, different 5 versions went into different departments, and everybody cut along their format. And mainly they were cutting from the back, because they knew the back, the last end, is less important. So if you really just have 1 minute, you were sure that the first minute is the most important thing, and then you just cut it. And by ear, we were trained of sort of having the structure that is already there, that's been made by the journalist, is something, you know, that you really could distinguish and find these different segments or abstracts or paragraphs in the piece that he's using to say this is important, and then you would combine it. And in that thing, we sort of, you know, that would be a practical approach for fairly easy, trying to find out if we can make a program a little bit more adaptive. And what we used was, we didn't just take 3, but eventually we decided to take 5 levels, because, you know, you don't have to take 5 levels at a time, but 5 always leaves the opportunity to reduce to 3 and not restrict yourself to just 3, because sometimes with 3 levels it's getting, you know, these, what is in many surveys, you have these 5, you know, distinctions between less interested, a little bit interested, medium interested, very important, and, you know, important and very important. And that's why we choose 5 levels of importance, which is a very basic approach. And if you turn it around the other way, it would be something like, you know, on level 1, it would be the shortest information, and on level 5, you get the complete context available. So if you just turn it upside down, you have the other way around, you know, for the length. So this is the relationship for length and depth that we agreed upon in the Orpheus pilot phase 2 to use for our piece. And what we did was, we already took one of the pieces that we had produced, and which is on the pilot already in phase 1B. We have a nice little thing produced at BR, which we call experience object-based audio, which is a typical, it's from one of our science editors who's very interested in audio, and he sort of explains what object-based audio is. And what I did was, I took the manuscript, and these are just the first 2 pages of 4, and I thought to try to identify these abstracts related to these 5 levels. So what is what? And I tried to make it a little bit larger, and you see I just colored it for the moment. And you see one of the key things, the definition, so to speak, what is object-based audio, he has somewhere in the middle. This is that red parrot, so how should we picture object-based audio? And then he sort of, you know, gives a picture that it's like something we know from everyday life. It's like, you know, all those objects making noise in reality and these kind of things. And this is the key definition if you really strip it down. And the rest, level 2, for example, is in orange, and then so this story unfolds. And if you put that then and have a look at the audio, and this is just the narrator, and you just color these different segments. This is for easier purpose. I did that in Reaper, not in Sequoia, because it has nice colors, so you can really color these things. And then you see the level 1 is something like very short. The total piece is 13 minutes, and the level 1 would be just like 1 minute. But if you really put it into the position of the whole piece in the sequence, you really see, again, this pyramid, you know, just the other way around, because he's telling a story. So he's not a classical news piece that he does. Otherwise, he would have had to make this definition already in the beginning, so that would have been the first thing to use. But he's sort of telling a story which tells, well, there is something like we started with recording 100 years ago, and he's telling a story, and somewhere in the middle he comes to the point, and then he gives the definition, and then sort of, you know, gives some more examples. So this is a nice representation that it is like a pyramid. If you really have the look, that red sequence is right in the middle of the piece. That was the very simple approach we took. And the next step was, of course, just to take these, you know, you see those bars coming down, to take these segments and then to transport their time values or their timestamps back into the audio. And then again, of course, we did that with Sequoia. And there again, you see on the top the narrator. And what we did, I think, and Marius already showed that in the previous presentation, we just put in some time markers and just, you know, labeled them level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5, you know, and all these segments. And from there, the whole thing went into the EBU core, where there is exactly something like that in the description, where there is a possibility to describe content level, and we just put in these numbers. Very simple. And of course, for the practical play out, it meant that what comes out from the Sequoia was with a metadata extraction made by Elephant Candy. We took out that EBU core part where the levels and segments are described, and the audio went into the MPEG-H encoder, and this was transferred into a JSON file which comes along on the stream, and then finally in the end user device it gets reassembled again. So that's the basic thing, and if you have a look at the app, that's exactly how you see it there. So you have, when you put the slider from left to right, you have on the left-hand side, you have the level 1, which means the highest bars right here in the segment you would see in the middle, and then of course you would expand or reduce the program just accordingly. So to sum up, well, we took a very practical approach. And what are the benefits of this approach? And for me, it was important at this point in the project to say everything we do is based still on editorial decisions, which means the editors or the author of the piece, quite often they have the structure in their head and they know how they do it. In filmmaking, you know that Hollywood films come out in the standard cinema version, but later there's sometimes a director's cut, where you have some, you know, extra scenes which are not in there. It's something like also in broadcasting, in linear broadcasting. Quite often we have to reduce ourselves to 30 minutes of program, but quite often we have more material that we could say we would fill up 40 minutes or 45 minutes. So in the on-air world, of course, we have to reduce ourselves to 30 minutes because that's the on-air time of the program. But it wouldn't matter for on-demand really to offer the longer version, which has, you know, maybe some more interesting stuff that people want to listen to if they listen on demand. So as I've tried to show, what we did, it's some sort of, I would call, implicit practice, because journalists are used to that. So you can easily, hopefully, persuade them to use this sort of structuring. It's also something, as I just said, it's more or less already existing in the daily workflow, because, you know, they know it and they say, oh yeah, we have to cut it down to 3 minutes, but we have 3 minutes 15, so how to slice it up. I think it's still fairly easy to implement, as you've seen in Sequoia. So just put on some labels onto your tracks, and then there you go. It's scalable, of course. You can use it 5 levels. You can use it less levels, of course. For example, if you say there are just 2 versions, a shorter and a longer one, you would just, distinguish between level 1 and level 2. So it's just, you don't have to use 5. And it's also for various purposes. So as I just said, you could have some different sort of edits within the same piece that you need, for example, for different stations or different outputs. What we still have to do, I think, to make this really work, is not less on the practical side, but of course what we did now with the labels and with the markers on top, this is the first approach. You could really imagine that the user interface to make that could be better. There are more improvements. I would love to think about a flexible timeline, which is something like that, but there's something for developers and user interface people to think about that. Of course, it needs some refinements for complex audio productions. And an issue still to be solved is, in that respect, the background crossfade. If you have, for example, background noises going on or background sounds or music, you need to go from A to B. It works perfect just for speech, but for music and background, you need something that we haven't implemented yet already. And of course, there's also the opportunity of creating alternative transition, which means if you want to go from A to D, you need probably a part B, which you don't need for C or something like that. But the people I worked with in the project said, oh yes, we can think about that and there's possible solution, but actually we did not, we weren't able to do that all in that short of time. And I say that because a practical approach, because I think in the future with more advanced possibilities of keyword and auto-analysis, some artificial intelligence or deep learning things, whatever you might want to call them, will come anyway. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Werner. Really, really interesting. You guys got any questions for Werner? Excellent.
Actually, Werner, you almost answered it, but right now it's just straight cuts between the individual segments. So, but also cuts where there is basically no audio, because if you do a cut where there's audio, you might get clicks or whatever. So no fade, no nothing, just a straight cut.
As I said, it's just focused on speech.
On speech only at the moment, yeah, okay. But you're working on fades and these things because, of course, essentially if there's music backgrounds or whatever.
Trying out,
yeah.
But we must admit it's a little bit more complex. They say it's possible. I'm not so much into coding to know all these other things. But as we've seen, for example, in the early BBC example, it seems that yes, you can do that, but you need some more intelligence in the background, to handle the audio.
Of course.
And it's a matter of, really having a look into that. As I said, I'm not a coder, I'm just a journalist. What can you do in EBU core, and how would you provide audio, and what about those different,
I imagine it being rather complex, that you might need shorter fades in certain areas, longer fades in others, for the same material, depending what the transition is.
But basically, if we think about what we're doing in the DAW now already, is we have it in the DAW in the different sessions file. Exactly the same thing. You define this sort of crossfade file, and it knows from the play out you have to use this one, and it just drops it in. It seems that it could also be possible on the other hand.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. Oh. Oops. Oh, ist er runtergefallen. Jetzt. Ja, danke.
So, Harald Glaser, Westdeutscher Rundfunk, German television. My question is, if we think about the snapshot of Sequoia with the pyramid, where it showed the very short piece, highest level, and the long piece, everything together. It looked for me still linear in that matter, that the order of the pieces was still from start to end. Is that right?
This piece, yes.
So in this matter, it's still the same thinking as with the tape machine. Is that right?
Yeah.
So, or is there a possibility to saying, to turn around
these segments?
Yep.
Well, it's a matter of description. I think you could say something to that. I think it's with JSON, it would be something like possible.
Yeah, so in fact, there are two things that you can do. So one is the BBC approach, where you calculate all the possible narratives. We decided not to do that as it's way too complex. The other way would be to attach even more information, and then filter not only on importance, but also on preference, or what would fit a certain time best. Yeah, that's all possible.
Thanks, Niels. Actually, that's probably a great point to move to the next presentation. So, Werner, thank you very much for that. Absolutely fascinating.